Hello everyone, my name is Matt Shar, and today I'll be doing a critique of my call-in to the internet-based TV show The Atheist Experience, hosted by Matt Dillahunty. My point in calling was not to try to give a defense of the resurrection, but was to try to point out the fact that Matt Dillahunty is unwilling to accept the testimony of another that a miracle occurred, and that when he says that he wants evidence of miracles having occurred, he means scientifically and empirically verifiable evidence, which requires repeated observation. Then I wanted to point out the fact that if resurrections were sufficiently common that we could have scientifically and empirically verifiable evidence of them occurring, their resurrection would cease to function as a unique proof of God's existence. At which point I assumed that he would contradict himself and state that it was okay for the resurrection to be a one-time event in the distant past prior to it being open to scientific inquiry. Once a person concedes that the resurrection can be a one-time event in the distant past prior to being open to scientific investigation, we move into the realm of historical investigation, which requires one to assess the quality, quantity, and kind of witness testimony available to the event.
Line 6. Matt, you are on with Dragnot and Matt. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm exceptional.
I just had a couple of questions for you that I'd like to ask, and it's great that you have the scientist guy on there because it has to do with the collection of evidence and how one would interpret it as it relates to miracles.
Cool.
Okay, so I've heard you say before in debates that if one was to want to posit a miracle as an explanation for something that took place in the distant past, that they would have to see miracles happening now. Would you agree with that? Or that they would have to be demonstrable?
No, I don't think you would have to see a miracle now in order to confirm a miracle in the past. My answer is okay. I have no idea how one would go about confirming a miracle either in the past or now, but certainly it's more difficult if you're trying to analyze a miracle claim from long in the past.
Okay. And would you say that, if miracles did happen on a very regular basis now and were repeatable scientifically and things of that nature, from a science perspective, would a scientist see something that is, supposedly an anomaly in science, and they were to see that it's repeatable, would they then determine that if they couldn't explain it, that it was a miracle, or would they just call it an unexplainable natural phenomenon?
If there is a phenomenon that is happening that is inexplicable, right, that we can investigate, then I hate to break it to you, it's not supernatural. So calling it a miracle. So you would agree that?
Well, the big thing. So there were a couple confusing things in there because it sounded like you said something that was refuted by science. Is that what you said? Or
no, repeatable.
Repeatable
Science.
So we have
do tests on it.
I'm trying to understand. You're talking about a phenomenon that is occurring that's repeatable. First of all, we don't define thing as inexplicable, because that's a declaration that it is unexplainable, and that's different from unexplained. And so when we observe something and we don't currently have an explanation for it, we keep going until we get an explanation. And at no point does our absence of an explanation mean that we get to say, that's a miracle.
Okay. So if it was the case that you, say, witnessed maybe 10 or 15 people throughout the course of the last 150 years or so, who died and then were resurrected, and this could be demonstrably proven by science.
Happens all the time.
The dead.
Happens all the time.
Okay, but I mean
people. No.
After a public execution.
Okay.
Somebody's beheaded.
Yeah. So we behead somebody, and then 3 days later they're up and walking around, and we've had them under we've had them under proper test conditions where we're observing them the entire time. Yeah, that'd be really incredible. Do you have anything remotely like that?
I know, but my question is, if that was the case, would a scientist then say, "Oh, well, we're going to call this a miracle"? Or
No. Hang on. Let's get off the miracle label, because that's irrelevant. What would happen is a scientist would say, "Hey, we have a dozen accounts now that are well documented of someone having their head lopped off and then getting up and walking around 3 days. Do we have an explanation for that? No." And until you have an explanation, you don't get to claim what the explanation is. And that goes not only for the scientists who are exploring it, but for the non-scientists who want to claim that it's supernatural. Because supernatural is something that you need to demonstrate.
It would not be ever called a miracle then, right? You would just say...
Somebody would call it a miracle. What difference does it make? Somebody's going to call it a miracle now. What difference does it make if they call it a miracle? What we're talking about here is, can you demonstrate supernatural causation or not?
And the answer would be no from your perspective, I assume. Is that correct?
Has anybody ever demonstrated a mechanism by which we can confirm supernatural causation?
No, of course not. I mean, I also don't think that it's
then we're stuck.
possible to
There
do
you
that.
go.
Yeah, I'm not saying. Here's the thing. I'm not saying that that's the case forever. Maybe tomorrow somebody will come up with a way to demonstrate that the supernatural is real and show how it can interact with reality and how we can test for that and confirm it. But until that happens, we're stuck.
Notice how Dragnot states that if something can be investigated scientifically, that is automatically not supernatural. Then, Matt Dillahunty says that even with the dozen resurrections that took place following a beheading, which were all under proper scientific observation and testing, we are still not permitted to confirm that it's a miracle unless we can find some kind of a scientific test to determine supernatural causation. So they're literally looking for scientific confirmation of the supernatural while saying that if science can confirm it, then it's automatically not supernatural. So that in and of itself is a contradictory demand for evidence.
Now, as that relates to the situation with Jesus and the resurrection and all that, I'm a Christian, so I assume you probably knew I was going there.
But I mean,
if that was the case.
But let me ask you. Do you disagree with the conclusion that I reached right there, that until we are able... Okay.
I mean, well, I would feel comfortable positing a supernatural explanation if the person who died and rose again was like, okay, I'm going to die and rise again. And then they did it, and they said God is the mechanism by which this took place. I would actually feel, comfortable taking their word for it. But
see, that's actually a huge mistake, because if I told you that I could levitate in front of you, and then I did it, and then I told you the reason I was able to levitate is because I am in fact God, and you're comfortable just accepting that, you would turn out to be wrong.
Not levitation. I mean, if you were like demonstrably dead, though, like if I witnessed you be killed in a public execution,
okay, sure,
then risen from the dead, that'd be a little bit different. Would you agree?
It would be different, but I wouldn't necessarily accept their claim about it, because that's not confirmation. That's still just a claim.
Then he says that I would make a mistake if I was to take the word of the person who was resurrected. If a person came up to me and said, I'm going to die and rise again, then I witnessed them be killed in a public execution, then rise from the dead, and they told me that God was the mechanism by which this took place, because he is able to trick people into believing that he's levitated. So this is obviously a false analogy, because the two things aren't even remotely similar.
The question I have, though, is you're a Christian, and so
yes.
And so on some level, you are accepting a claim that somebody died, resurrected, and gave credit to God when you don't have any evidence that any of that actually happened.
Notice how he says there's no evidence that any of that actually happened. What he means is that there's no scientific or empirically verifiable evidence that it took place. But this is not the only form of evidence. Eyewitness testimony is the same reason that you believe almost anything else from history that doesn't leave archaeological remains.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that there's no evidence that it happened. I mean, there's numerous, like witnesses that testified to it.
No, we have no witnesses that account to it.
Like, so Paul is not a witness to the resurrection?
Of course not. Paul didn't know anything about Jesus until after Jesus was already dead.
So if a being, right, just like appeared in the sky, right, and blinded you, okay, if that was the case, hypothetically, and then this being communicated with you and said, I'm Jesus, I'm risen from the dead, all these things, you'd be like, no, I don't believe you.
No. See, this is the thing that you're missing out on. If that happened to me, if some being appeared to me, then I might maybe have good reason to believe it, but nobody else would, because revelation is necessarily first person, according by Hume, and to everybody else it's hearsay. But you're not just going on secondhand accounts. You're accepting a story for which you can verify none of the details, including whether or not the person who's relating the story, you even have an accurate description from them of their account.
Matt Dillahunty says that there is no eyewitness testimony to the resurrection. This is just a patently false claim. Even if it was the case that we didn't have primary source documents, meaning a person witnessed something firsthand and then themselves actually wrote the account down, we still have the testimony of the Jerusalem apostles as delivered by Paul, and then we also have the epistles of Jude, Peter, and John as well. It goes on to say that Paul cannot be a witness to the resurrection because Paul didn't know what Jesus looked like prior to his death, but says that he might have a good reason to believe that it's Jesus if a being appeared to him in the sky and blinded him and identified themselves as Jesus. But then goes on to say that while he may have good reason to believe it, nobody else would, because revelation is necessarily first person, and to everybody else it's hearsay, according to Hume. This is ridiculous. If we accept Paul's testimony that a being appeared to him in the sky and identified themselves as Jesus, then just like Paul has a good reason to believe it's Jesus, we have a good reason to believe it's Jesus.
Would you only be willing to believe a miracle, like on the testimony of another, if the person was alive, or would you be willing to accept?
I wouldn't believe a miracle on testimony. I wouldn't believe a miracle on testimony. I would believe that somebody is.
You would have to see it yourself.
Can I finish?
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I would believe that someone is accurately trying to tell me what happened, but that doesn't mean I should believe their explanation for what happened. And that's a firsthand account. Do you believe people are being abducted by aliens?
No.
Okay, but you realize that there are people you can talk to right now who will tell you their alien abduction story. That's not supernatural. Yeah. It's not a miracle, and yet you're willing to discount their personal testimony, and yet you will accept a copy of a translation of a copy from somebody who you don't know, can't investigate at all. You're willing to accept that that is sufficient evidence of a risen person.
Do you believe some news stories and not other news stories?
I asked you a question.
Every news story.
I asked you
I'm perfectly comfortable with it because I have spent a lot of time actually.
Your turn, because I have no interest in speaking with somebody who's perfectly comfortable with dismissing. Shut up, I'm talking. With dismissing some firsthand accounts that are not particularly extraordinary or less extraordinary, and accepting.
I wouldn't necessarily discount all of them.
Then Matt Dillahunty plainly says that he wouldn't believe a miracle on testimony. So he would actually have to witness the miracle for himself firsthand and be able to scientifically confirm supernatural causation. Then he asks if I believe in alien abduction stories, which is a terribly false analogy because there's no example of an alien abduction story that has multiple generations of a certain people group all testifying to having seen the same alien or species of alien, then having written correspondence that demonstrates a knowledge outside of the ability for the people who are writing the letter to have at the time that they were writing it, then correspondence between a leader of a certain movement and the followers of that movement, with the leader telling them that they know that they currently possess alien technology and use it on a regular basis. Whereas with respect to the Bible, we have multiple generations of a certain people group who are demonstrating the ability to have knowledge that is outside of their time domain. Then when we get to the New Testament, we have all the reported miracles of Jesus, which are attributed to him by multiple sources. Then we also have Paul's epistles in the New Testament, which talk about miracles as though they're common knowledge to the recipients of his letters, even stating that the people know that they have miraculous gifts in his absence, and citing the miracles that the recipients of his letters know that they saw as the reason why they came to Christ in the first place. So there's nothing similar to that for alien abduction stories. And even if it was the case that there was an alien abduction story that had some kind of similarity to that, accepting one set of supernatural claims doesn't require that one accepts all sets of supernatural claims. If one was to say believe that aliens did exist, it doesn't mean that they have to believe Bigfoot exists. Each thing has to be assessed on a claim-by-claim basis and evaluated for the quantity, quality, and kind of witness testimony available to the events. Then Matt Dillahunty says that I'm accepting a copy of a translation of a copy from people who I don't know and can't investigate. The reality is that he means I can't investigate the story scientifically or empirically, but I absolutely can investigate it historically. The fact that it's a copy of a copy and that the story has been translated is true of everything that a person believes from ancient history. So whether you're learning about a war that took place in Assyria, ancient events that took place in Egypt, or the events described in the New Testament, everything is coming, and if you don't speak those languages, everything is coming down to us from copies of copies, and then they've been translated into at least one or another language prior to them being received by us. But if we were to throw out anything that was to be verified by that kind of a standard, then we couldn't believe anything from ancient history. Also, even Dr. Bart Ehrman will tell you that the New Testament has been handed down in such a way that the vast majority of the variants are spelling differences or things that are totally meaningless and can't even be translated into English. And no variant affects any kind of core Christian doctrine or any central teaching of the Christian church. The reality is that the New Testament is the best attested work of an ancient past, and we have more manuscripts of it than any other ancient document many times over.
Okay, so
Never mind.
Your issue here is that you're relying on personal anecdotes. Do you see that?
Well, I mean, it would be personal anecdotes from several different people.
That's fine. So
multiple sources.
Do multiple anecdotes equal empirical evidence? How does that work?
No, of course not. No,
okay.
I don't think you can prove a miracle in the same way you can prove science.
Okay,
I think it's ridiculous to suggest that one could.
Now, you would admit that empirical evidence would trump anecdotal evidence, correct?
Well, of course. Yeah, I mean, it'd be better evidence, but it doesn't mean that the other thing didn't happen.
Okay, so while I agree that some anecdotes can actually be true, it can actually reflect reality, but that's contingent, right? Based on what we see in reality. Have you actually seen someone be resurrected, like actually be beheaded? Personally, have you?
No, of course not.
Then Dragnot states that my problem is that I'm accepting personal anecdotes, which don't equal empirical evidence. And obviously I agree with that, but the fact is that nothing from history can be empirically verified. The fact is we can't repeat the historical event, so everything has to come from personal anecdotes unless it leaves some kind of archaeological remain. So eyewitness testimony is the reason we believe anything else from history. So if a miracle is to function as unique proof of God's existence, then we should expect that the evidence for that miracle is going to be from eyewitness testimony.
Okay, so then...
But I think that if it was the case that it happened enough times throughout history where everybody got to see it, it would be so commonplace that it wouldn't really be accepted as
That is a load. That is absolutely a load. Because even if it becomes so commonplace that it's no longer extraordinary, like if people were being killed and resurrected daily, that fundamentally does not mean that it would be dismissed in the case of the resurrection that you prefer. This isn't
Jesus' resurrection would remain unique if it happened on a regular basis.
Okay, so now you think it's unique, and
no, I'm asking. I believe it is unique. I think Jesus is the only person who's actually experienced a true resurrection in the way it's described in the Gospels.
Really? So you're dismissing when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and you're dismissing the dead when the dead rose on Jerusalem when the curtain was torn?
He died after. Yeah, no, I mean Lazarus died after. And everybody else...
After what? After what?
Well, he lived... It's not as though he lived forever, right? He's not like alive now. He still died again. It's kind of like I'm a paramedic, and if we get like a resuscitation...
You are now officially... I wish I had a crown to give you. As the king of post hoc rationalizations, you are dancing around, and every time I point to a problem with your belief, you just go on to something else. Oh, Jesus is the only person... Shut up. Shut up.
Okay, sure.
Jesus is the only person who experienced resurrection. What about Lazarus? What about the dead that rose in Jerusalem? Well, Jesus is the only one that experienced resurrection and stayed alive.
His objection to my stating that Jesus' resurrection was unique is really demonstrative of a person who lacks basic knowledge of Christian doctrine. The reality is that he's arguing under the assumption that Lazarus was actually raised, and so if we're operating under the assumption that the New Testament is true, then it logically follows that Lazarus, having died again after his being vivified, is different than Jesus being raised to immortal spirit life.
So you have no existence. You have no evidence that Jesus existed. You have no evidence that he was killed. No good evidence. Sorry, I mean, of course you have anecdotal accounts in the Bible. You don't have good evidence that he was resurrected, and you don't have good evidence that he's still alive.
Then he says that there's no good evidence that Jesus existed or that Jesus actually died. Then he concedes the point that there is what he calls anecdotal evidence. But the reality is that even Dr. Bart Ehrman will say that the crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate, as described in the Gospels, is about as certain a historical data as one can possibly ask for from the ancient past. So the reality is that this is demonstrating a lack of knowledge of history and what one should actually seek in confirming a historical report.
Well, I mean, you'd have to kind of define good evidence, because, like, what kind of...
We literally did that earlier.
Yeah.
We literally
been there, done that. Basically, the evidence that you're presenting is...
Well, according to you, but my question...
According to reasonable standards of evidence.
At this point, I asked him to define what he means by good evidence, and he and Dragnot state that they had already answered that question, so I'm left believing that they mean objectively and empirically verifiable evidence, which is only available through scientific observation and repeated testing.
And also, by the way, according to you, because you don't believe people's testimonial accounts that they're being abducted by aliens, you are creating a special case scenario where you are accepting testimonial accounts that aren't firsthand, that you can't verify, for something that is more extraordinary than the claim that people are being abducted by aliens. You are the one with flawed standards of evidence, and this is obvious and demonstrable.
Well, if it was, just out of curiosity, if it was the case, right, that somebody was being abducted by an alien, right, and I didn't witness it myself, it's not that I would automatically discount their testimony. I would have to see how did it affect their lives, what kind of corroborating evidence do they have, how many witnesses really were there, and are these witnesses consistent with what I should expect?
Have you bothered to look?
About the alien account, or in terms of the resurrection?
About the alien abductions. Have you bothered to investigate them?
No.
And yet you don't believe them.
Like, you guys,
and yet you don't believe them, and you're willing to dismiss them.
Out of hand. I mean, I just haven't looked at it. If you presented one that had the same...
I'm not here to try to convince you of this, because I don't believe they've been abducted by aliens. I don't believe they've been abducted by aliens either. See, one of us has good standards of evidence, and so is not believing these extraordinary claims. The other one has standards of evidence, and so you're dismissing some extraordinary claims and believing more extraordinary claims.
Well, I'm not dismissing him. I'd have to take it on a claim-by-claim basis.
Matt Dillahunty then parrots the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence slogan that a lot of non-believers will use in arguing against New Testament miracles. The reality is that what we should actually seek is a sufficient amount of normal evidence. The kind of evidence that one would need to establish a resurrection is that a person died and that they were alive again after. So we have obviously a sufficient amount of evidence that Jesus died. Then really the issue is, do we have a sufficient body of data to prove that people interacted with him after his death? If that's the case, then a resurrection is established, and the reason we'd be believing it is on a sufficient amount of normal evidence.
So, just like you believe some news stories and not other news stories, I'd have to take it on a claim.
These aren't news stories.
I know, but I'm just saying, in the same way that you would verify a certain news story and disbelieve it, or verify a news story and believe it.
Yeah. How do we verify the resurrection account?
Well, the resurrection account would be on eyewitness testimony.
You have no eyewitness testimony. Yeah, there are no eyewitness accounts of eyewitness accounts of the resurrection. Paul is not.
So Paul and James.
Paul is not an eyewitness to the resurrection. He claims to have witnessed the risen Jesus after
after he was dead.
Yeah, he's not a witness to the resurrection.
Not a witness to the resurrection?
Correct.
How can somebody witness Jesus alive after he was dead but not be a witness to the resurrection?
That's a lie.
First of all, he didn't witness a bodily Jesus after the resurrection. If you want to go that route, you would be talking about the apostles that Jesus supposedly appeared to in a bodily form, where even doubting Thomas supposedly wanted to stick his fingers in the nail holes. But instead, you go to Paul. What about what?
James, the Lord's brother.
Okay, I have a story in a book that references that. I have no evidence beyond the story.
He says in reference to the gospel accounts, these aren't news stories. So I'm left to wonder what it is that he calls it when a person who's expertly trained in the best schools in composition and history goes and investigates multiple witnesses to a certain series of events, then writes down that account for people to read later on. To me, that's a news story. Then Matt Dillahunty repeats his opinion that there's no eyewitness testimony to the resurrection to be found in the New Testament. So imagine there was a crime that took place, and a police officer went and interviewed a witness to this crime, and he gave his account in detail, and the police officer composed a written narrative of the events that took place from the testimony of the witness. Then a journalist came and interviewed the police officer. Then somebody from a TV news agency took the report from the journalist and passed it on to an editor who prepared the information so that it would be appropriate for a teleprompter. Then a news anchor reads the information off of the teleprompter and you're listening to it on the nightly news. That would still be eyewitness testimony to a crime. So even if it wasn't the case that we had the epistles, which are actually primary source documentation, meaning the people who actually witnessed the events wrote them down themselves or dictated them directly to a scribe, we have the Gospels containing the testimony of the Jerusalem apostles. So even within the Gospels, even if they weren't written directly by the person who actually witnessed the events, they're still containing eyewitness testimony in the same way that when you hear something on the news of a report of some kind of crime, it is eyewitness testimony to that crime. Then he repeats his opinion that Paul can't be an eyewitness to the resurrection because Jesus didn't appear to Paul in bodily form. Well, having just said earlier that Paul didn't know what Jesus looked like prior to his death. So what good would it be if Jesus appeared to Paul in bodily form if Paul didn't know what he looked like to confirm that it was actually Jesus? So the fact is that either Paul was hallucinating or making it up, or a being appeared to Paul in the sky and blinded him and said that it was Jesus who was appearing. And we have every bit as good a reason to believe that it was Jesus as Paul did. Then I mentioned James as a direct witness to the resurrection, which he throws out automatically because it's listed in the Bible. Well, the reality is that historians will tell you that a disinterested comment like the one made in Galatians, where Paul speaks of James, the Lord's brother, as though his existence is common knowledge to the Galatian Christians, that's considered extremely significant to historians. So in addition to that, in Josephus, we actually have a passage that describes James as being the brother of Jesus, and it also talks about his martyrdom by stoning by the Sanhedrin. So the reality of the situation is that we absolutely do have direct eyewitnesses who are immediate family members of Jesus who say that he rose from the dead. And this is significant because James was actually not a follower of Jesus prior to Jesus' death. So James came to believe that Jesus was God incarnate after Jesus was executed in public as a blasphemer. So something really significant would be required to make a change like that happen. So this is pretty common. What you find with people is that they'll sort of just deny any Christian claim because it's a Christian who's saying it, so they'll just sort of reject it out of hand.
how much evidence would you expect beyond the story than what we have?
How much would I expect? Okay, that's a really good question. Because if there was a God who came down and took human form and sacrificed himself to serve as a loophole so that to save everybody and expected people to accept this on good standards of evidence, then we wouldn't have anonymous hearsay accounts with no ability to verify it. That God should be smart enough to make sure that there is solid evidence to confirm the accounts so that I can't poke holes in your thing the same way I poke holes in flat earthers and anti-vaxxers and other garbage beliefs.
Then he goes on to use a slogan that he likes to use where he says that if there was a God who sacrificed himself to serve as a loophole to save everybody, then that God should be smart enough to leave evidence that didn't require us to believe anonymous and hearsay accounts that aren't open to the charge of dishonesty or incompetence on the part of the witnesses, which is implicit in his comparing Christian belief to anti-vaxxers and flat earthers. So the reality of the situation is that there's nothing in history which can be confirmed this way. So anything in history is going to be secondhand because you can't repeat the events of the past in order to monitor them and observe them and test them scientifically. So the reality is that most of the New Testament actually is not anonymous. So in the epistles of Paul, James, Jude, and John, and Peter, it actually does list the name of the person who's actually writing the epistle. In addition to that, in John chapter 21, verse 20 through 24, it states that John is the disciple of love who actually bears witness to the events and is the one who wrote them down himself.
So just out of curiosity, as it relates to that, like the standard of evidence and the things that you're asking, or the things that you were saying, are you suggesting that God should have multiple resurrections occur over the course of history?
It's fine to have just the one. It's fine to have just the one, but provide good evidence for it. But it has to happen
later when everybody can investigate it scientifically. Is that correct?
Wow.
So at this point, I asked him if he would need multiple resurrections to have happened throughout history so that he could have empirically verifiable data, or if it would just have to happen maybe once, but later on in history where it could be scientifically investigated, and he indicates that that's not the case. So then he says that it's okay for it to happen once at a fixed point in the past prior to it being open to scientific investigation. At which point the reality is that the only kind of evidence that you could really look for is eyewitness testimony to the events. So the kind of evidence that one should actually seek in trying to determine a resurrection can be found in abundance in the New Testament. The fact is that when he says he's seeking evidence, or says that my standards of evidence are flawed, he is seeking objectively and empirically verifiable evidence which can only be confirmed through repeated scientific observation. And no evidence of that kind can be found for any ancient historical event. So the reality is that our standards of evidence are perfectly good. We're just actually seeking the kind of evidence that one should actually seek in trying to confirm a resurrection.
I'm asking an honest question because I want to know. I mean, I
answered your question, but I'm going to let Drag do it.
So the issue here, I think it's maybe a better question. What would disabuse you of this belief? Hypothetically.
If you could find I guess it would take, I don't know, maybe like a hostile account saying that they actually witnessed Jesus not having died, like actually themselves, like a first-hand or second-hand, account that was.
Wait, so you're saying a report that somebody didn't die?
No, but I'm just saying in the situation, right, where they could demonstrably prove, it's something from the distant past, though. It's not really the same as something that can be investigated scientifically now. So what I'm trying to understand is, if you were to believe that a resurrection happened, it would have to happen now, and it would have to happen.
No. Stop, Matt. I did not. You keep stop and shut up for a second. When I say stop, just stop. You keep trying. I swear to God, you interrupt me one more time, and I'm going to hang up. You keep saying things like, you would expect it to need to happen now, and I've said no to that repeatedly. What Drag is asking you right now is, here we have an account, a biblical account, of a man who supposedly died and supposedly was resurrected. And you're accepting that account at face value, and he wants to know what would make you no longer accept that.
So having talked himself into a circle, he hands it over to Dragnot to answer the question of what is the evidence that he's actually looking for. And Dragnot immediately changes the subject and says, well, what would disabuse you of this belief, or what would it take for me to stop believing the resurrection as a historical event? And I offer up maybe a first or second-hand witness that actually records Jesus not having died, meaning maybe somebody from like a Roman government who could actually record the fact that Jesus was not actually executed and that it was made up, or a number of other things like that would be potentially possible. But really, you can't just say something that's going to automatically change your whole entire worldview based on one line of evidence, because you don't form a worldview based on one line of evidence. So in the absence of some really powerful defeater, it's reasonable, even if there was some sort of contrary evidence, to still believe in the resurrection if the evidence for the resurrection could be a sufficient quality, quantity, and kind of evidence to overwhelm that defeater.
And you come back with, oh, so you would expect it to happen now? No, give me,
I'm not sure exactly.
Jesus.
Give me the evidence for the account. And then to answer Drag's question, it would be, what would change your mind? What would convince you that you shouldn't believe this?
Right.
Because everything we've tried has failed. When we say, okay, do you believe in alien abductions? No. But they're more plausible, and by your own standards, the resurrection of Jesus is unique.
Right.
Alien abduction stories are not unique. So they don't require anything necessarily supernatural. By definition, they are vastly more probable or likely.
Yeah, it's weird how, his skepticism seemed to kick in when it involved aliens. Like, his personal credulity is really interesting. It's almost like there's a bias toward wanting to believe this particular narrative.
You'd think so. It's weird.
He ends the call with saying, give me the evidence for the account. And again, I spent the entire call trying to get to the bottom of what kind of evidence he's actually even looking for. So the reality is he's looking for scientific evidence of a historical event, and that kind of evidence can exist, which is actually kind of funny, because then he goes on to accuse me of setting up a situation where the thing that it would take to change my mind could never happen. Then he says that alien abductions are far more likely to be true than a resurrection, because a resurrection is a miracle, whereas alien abductions would not be a miracle. So this is only true if one assumes that God does not exist. So what we should actually be doing is remaining neutral to the God idea and neutral to the possibility of aliens existing, then investigating every claim on a claim-by-claim basis and assessing it for the quality, quantity, and kind of witness testimony to the events.
So this guy, I actually recognize his questions because he emailed in sometime in the last week or so. And he thinks that he's calling in to trap us.
Does he?
Because his line of argument is the sort of evidence that we would expect and accept to confirm a resurrection would render resurrections mundane. It would mean they would have to be occurring now all the time, and we would have to be able to investigate them. And if that's the case, then there's nothing unique or special about Jesus' resurrection, because it would just be another one of many.
Okay.
And that our bias towards good evidence means that we could never confirm something in the past.
Yeah, see, there's so many issues with that. If I was, let's say, and I think we spoke about this, if I was a philosophical naturalist, I could see that being a problem. But as a methodological naturalist, right, I can still entertain ideas of the supernatural. I can still entertain the existence of things outside of the physical realm or whatever. But what I've yet to actually hear is a way to investigate supernatural claims, because he isn't unique in his arguments. It's just like, I believe this, other people believe this, and other people said it happened, so yeah, you should just kind of believe it. And it's not convincing, no matter how many mental gymnastics you need to do in order to get to that point. It still does not hold water.
It's funny that when you asked him, what would disabuse you of this belief?
Very simple question.
It's a simple question, not necessarily an easy question.
Fair enough.
Especially if you don't have a good understanding of epistemology or standards of evidence. How do you know what you know, and how is it reasonable? But he went to, well, if somebody would show me that he didn't die, which I immediately jumped in on, because I'm like, that's more miraculous, I would say, than the thing you're actually advocating. There's a guy who has never died. He's on 6th Street every night,
So then he mentions epistemology, and he indicates that if I had a good understanding of epistemology, I wouldn't be believing these miraculous claims. So the reality is that there's actually a couple of different ways that one can arrive at knowledge. One is called a priori knowledge, or making a rational inference to the best explanation of something that you haven't personally experienced yourself. Or there's a posteriori knowledge, which is something that you would gain through repeated observation, something that you do on a regular basis. So the reality is that what Matt Dillahunty is doing is he's seeking a posteriori knowledge or repeated observation, something that he can see for the resurrection, when really we should be seeking a priori knowledge, which is the way that you establish any kind of a historical claim, is by making a rational inference to the best explanation for a set of data.
I had a debate in Red Deer, Canada, and I asked my opponent, people keep wanting me to ask this in debates, and I don't always do it, but I did in this case, what would change his mind when it comes to the resurrection? And his answer was, well, if we found a tomb that had Jesus's body in it. And I loved that answer because it shows everything about how he's thinking, and caller Matt is thinking exactly the same way.
Right.
Because, first of all, you are presuming that Jesus actually existed, and mythicists are going to challenge you on that, and you have no way to demonstrate that he did. I'm not saying he didn't. I'm fine with the notion that there may have been a Yeshua ben Joseph who was an itinerant rabbi who said some things and maybe got killed. That none of that's extraordinary. But you're beginning with, he definitely existed, and so if we were to find his tomb, that would mean he did not resurrect. Except, how would you ever verify that you found that particular Yeshua's tomb?
Right.
And it's not like we have DNA to verify.
Then Matt says that he's willing to believe that Jesus existed and that he got killed. But he's not willing to believe that the miracles took place because the miracles are miracles. So you can see the circular reasoning that undergirds his thinking and the way that his bias against the possibility of supernatural claims being true is very obvious. And so it's clear that this type of thinking is actually pervasive across the spectrum with respect to education, from all the way from Bart Ehrman, who's one of the most highly educated people on New Testament studies in the world, all the way down to Matt Dillahunty, who has no sort of formal education in the matter. So the fact is that really the only reason to doubt that the miraculous portions of the New Testament are true is because one assumes that God does not exist. But if we remain neutral to the God idea, we can see that the kind of evidence that we should actually seek in establishing historical miracles is abundant in the New Testament.
And this is why it's especially strange that if there's a God who wants people to believe this, why did he do it 2,000 years ago when we didn't have any ability to record anything, any ability to investigate, as far as DNA and all this other? Why not do it now?
Right.
Or maybe 100 years in the future when we have even better investigative methods?
Yeah.
Why is it that miracles drop off as our ability to investigate them increases? That seems rather strange to me.
It's really strange.
Vern actually shared a meme the other day that I loved, which is like, it's going along miracle claims, and then the invention or the discovery of scientific methods, and then it declines, and it goes along here at zero, and then photography, and it jumps back up, and then Photoshop, and it drops back off. It's
weird correlation there.
Or something along those lines. But yeah. And so the guy that I was debating in Red Deer, you don't have the ability to test to determine that body. But he set up a scenario that is unfalsifiable. And that means that he set up a scenario where the only thing that will change his mind is something that can never happen. And Matt's doing the same thing, because Matt is essentially saying, I'm going to believe this until you prove me wrong. And it almost doesn't even matter whether or not there's a way to prove him wrong or not. That's already a mistake. To say, I'm going to believe this.
Then Matt asked, why did God do it 2,000 years ago before it could be recorded? And then goes on to show a meme that shows exactly why that is. Because as soon as we have the ability to, video record things and have mass media, then we have the ability to alter video and have mass deception. So the reality is that video footage is only really helpful if you're willing to accept the testimony of another that a miracle occurred. Basically, if you're not a first-hand witness to these events, you're going to be accepting it on hearsay regardless. That's just the reality of life. That's how anything is that you haven't seen yourself. Whether you're watching the news or hearing a report from a friend, you're accepting what he would call personal anecdotes or hearsay in believing anything that you haven't seen yourself.
And what he said at one point, which we didn't really get into, was he's like, well, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And you're correct. We're not saying that this dearth of evidence means it didn't happen. We're saying that the absence of all this evidence means we cannot be rationally justified in claiming or accepting that it has. I don't need to claim Jesus wasn't resurrected. I don't need to prove it. I don't even need to believe it. My position is I'm not convinced that he was.
All right. How do we investigate any of these things? And so I've yet to have any type of metric where a theist has offered for me to investigate supernatural claims. So maybe there's a supernatural, I think there's a meme, but supernatural methodology or something. I don't know. Like I open that up for them to I guess contrive at some point in time. But I think we need a palate cleanser after that.
All right, where are we going now?
Then he refers to the evidence for the Christian worldview as a dearth of evidence. So when a person makes a statement like this, it's actually sad because they're obviously misinformed as to the actual quantity, quality, and kind of evidence for divine inspiration of Scripture, which is to be found in the Old Testament prophetic messages and the miracles and resurrection surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus, then the subsequent outpouring of the Spirit on the early church as reflected in Paul's writings and the writings of the early church fathers. So there's actually an enormous amount of evidence of the kind that we should actually expect for our worldview. It's just that he's looking for the wrong kind of evidence. Sadly, what you just saw represents the opinion of many non-believers that you'll meet. The reality is that when they demand evidence, they're looking for scientific and empirically verifiable evidence. But as Christians, what we can do is get them thinking about the purpose of miracles and how God would use them and what the consequences would be if it was the case that we had scientifically and empirically verifiable evidence for miracles. Once we enter the realm of investigating miracles like history, then the New Testament actually stands up very well compared to any other ancient document. It's just that most non-believers are unwilling to consider the possibility that a miracle happened because they haven't gotten to see one for themselves. So in that situation, we can either help them to understand the purpose of miracles and how one should actually seek evidence for them, or if they're unwilling and the only kind of evidence that they're willing to accept for a miracle having happened is scientific evidence, then the best that we can do is pray. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.